interest on this was Steve Rupp had a Photographers of Galena, Illinois, and I work one day a week in the historical room, and they have a lot of old photographs, and there's plenty of these carte de visites. And he had explained that there's photographers in Galena with the names, and after looking at a lot of the CDVs, there's photographers' names on the back. Um, and I was just curious. We focus on Galena, but Jo Daviess County is bigger. And since I have an interest in old cemeteries, and I've been getting farther east in the county and finding all these old cemeteries, I wanted to know, what other area photographers are on there. So it's just taking some pictures of those carte de visits and trying to find out some information on some of the other area photographers in our surrounding communities. Okay. Howard Huntington is on one of the cards, and it's not totally in order because that's his card. Uh, we don't write down names on the back. There is no name on this individual, so we don't know who it is, but it's got his name, and that doesn't look like an H, but it's Hanover, Illinois. And he was born in Vermont, and he dies in Baraboo, so he wasn't in Hanover for his entire career. And a lot of these photographers seem to have moved around. Quite a few did have a long business life in the communities, but quite a few went to other cities. Went to Baraboo. I was curious. That's where that circus museum is at. And I'm guessing he went to Seattle for relatives reasons. It's hard to find information because if you start searching nationwide, looking on newspapers, which ones to look, try to get a connection. We do have our papers online, which is a primary resource, the Illinois Digital newspapers, the Galena papers from 1869 to 1929. And there should be a whole batch that we just got back from 1838 up to 1944 that'll be sent down to the U of I. UIUC, used to be Champaign, University of Illinois. They have to upload it, so it's going to take them 3, 4, 5 months because we gave them like 30 something years or 40 years. I didn't edit any of this because you could edit these photos now and bring out the detail a little better. Warren, C.W. Dobler, and it's spelled with a U, without the U. This is probably out of order again because I haven't showed you any photos, but we'll get to that. F.J. Kolb was in Elizabeth. His first name is Frankline. I found him online. I had never heard of that. Frankline as opposed to Frank. He had lived there his entire life, 1860 to 1931. And the reference is Galena Daily Gazette, has that article on there. Dobler was in Warren, and I think he dies at Belvedere, but bigger city when you get older and retire, Rockford or Belvedere. So this is C.L. Leonard, is a photographer in Elizabeth. The name William Appel was on the back of the card, so that's the individual. I did find a William Appel, but I'm not sure that it's him. I didn't add anything more, and it's always curious to see if they have a name on there. If you can find something on Ancestry, then you'd put it on Find a Grave or Ancestor, and if there's any relatives currently, they might find one of their ancestors. And C.L. Leonard is Charles. Charles L. Leonard. He was in business roughly from 1870 to 1920. A little out of order, carte de visits or carte de visite. Around the Civil War, I think tintypes weren't the first photographs, but tintypes. And then shortly thereafter, carte de visite became in common. And we'll have an ad later where they could buy like a dozen of them for $2, and they're like baseball cards, and they'd hand them out. Leonard again. It was identified on back as a Matthew Galt. I did look up a little on him. He was in the Civil War. Look at the detail in these, though. And I haven't gotten into fashions or dating them and, stuff. But you can use that for the clothing styles, jewelry. They're not all that clear. That one is. That one is. I think when I got into this, I went down to the Warren has a library, and they also have a museum. The township does, and I have a picture in the township where I had quite a few of these photos that they had to try to find out the different photographers. They've got a nice little museum. It's not open a lot through the winter. Supposedly one day on Sunday, 1 to 4, and it's open more often in the summer when the weather's better. This is Frank Lines, the photographer. It's an unknown person. He appears to me to be an African American, and would this be a priest or a reverend? Minister? It'd be nice to know. You could look through the history and try to date it, because we do have a rough date for Franklin. Okay, W.S. Hansing, so we're at Stockton. The names were on the back. I think I got this from Craig Albaugh, so he tells me that's who they are. And I've got to check with him to see where he got his information, just to check it. I probably edited that since it's a black and white. Cowles was a photographer in Stockton. He also later on moved to Platteville, and I think he also moved to Maquoketa. And I believe I have a newspaper article to come up where he sold his business. But his is he was in Platteville from 1925 to 1939. You can barely see it on these imprint ones. We have a few in our family, and they're hard to see unless you twist it or get the light right, or if you put baby powder on it. Okay, Eddie Cowles had a photographer studio at Stockton for 20 years, sold off to Fred Bonhoff. I haven't found anything on Fred Bonhoff yet. But then Mr. Cowles is going to run that studio, or Fred will run it with the one in Elizabeth. So it's neighboring communities, but he's working 2 different offices, which is not unusual. He went to Maquoketa, and not on this one, but the next one is he would show up in Platteville. His journey was a little interesting to me. He was born in Nebraska, goes to Fond du Lac. How do you end up back at Stockton? Goes to Maquoketa and ends up in Platteville. It's just interesting to me since I grew up in this area. I did work in a different city, but it wasn't drastically far. Okay, that's just as a photo, just as a different size and style. I was just showing that it's only that size. These aren't that photo, but it's I've got a few of these. That happens to be, if anybody of you are from Galena, that's Minnie Ganchert. Allie Ganchert's wife, Franklin Street. Yes. Kids are Ganchert, Lorraine Rayhorn, Evelyn King. Lorraine had 12 or 13 kids. All those Rayhorns that are running around Galena on bikes or not bikes are her grandkids. He's related to Andrew Ganchert, who might be the Ganchert that was Galena High School principal, and on the east side, Ed Ganchert. I think that's Ed's dad. My relation is she's a sister to my grandfather, who you probably don't know either, is Walter Glick. But it's just the small size we were talking earlier on price. My thought would it'd be less expensive. And then the ones I'm passing around is I have about a dozen of those that were passed down from Evelyn King. That the hats in there for the millinery. They used to have real fancy things, hats, and I thought that was interesting. Elizabeth Durstein had a millinery shop. This one I bought in Madison about a week ago, and I bought it because of the hairstyle. So this one has a name. I haven't looked him up. Rufus Van Dusen. And it's got the photographer S.L. Buser Warren. And I put the W to remind me to put down where you get this. It's the Warren Museum. They had quite a few that were labeled. Okay, so Buser died at his winter home in Rockford. He was in the Civil War. And it's of interest to me. The 96 was a fairly big regiment from Galena that a lot of people were in. John Smith, one of our 9 generals, he was associated with that. And they had reunions after the Civil War that were fairly big, because John Smith was also Illinois Secretary of State, which I didn't know. And he was big in the Masons in Chicago. And they had a book published. It's down in the history room, and it's thick. It's got all the people that were listed in all the companies. One of the photographers in Apple River was Walter C. Wells. This is from the internet, the cabinet card photographer. Someone has looked up his history and found newspaper articles. So they have an example of a photo. And he starts out around, where are we at? Was born Ohio. But he went to Marengo, was in the Civil War, and after the Civil War, he bought a bunch of acres in Warren. But he showed up in Apple River. He goes back to Marengo and dies in Rockford. So that was, someone had done all this work before, which is interesting. And there's where the ad that they had at the time about the price. Says no Sunday work. And there's one of the examples that it's either here in the history room, W.C. Wells, Apple River. Unnamed baby again. It could be, now that you said it, that they blanked out the back, and it's a baby. And you have to sit for, I think, more almost a minute or so on these photographs. This is another Charles Leonard. And being we're looking at everything, what's this? Is that a grass or a fir? Or? But the dress, the detail, choker, her hair. It's a little bigger than a Bible. That's a Xerox of a picture of Charles Leonard, the photographer. It's in one of the Warren and Elizabeth books. Alderson, he didn't put any initials on the front. It's Warren. It is labeled on the back, Mabel Edie, or however we would say that. And what I looked up on Ancestry is there was a Mabel Edie, 1886 to 1888. that appears to be a 2-year-old girl, roughly, that her parents were Hosea and Carrie. And they lived longer, but that might be her. She's going, why are you taking this picture? Ancestry is where I retrieved this. This may be the photographer J.T. Alderson from Warren. It may be, because I've only got the one example and the one connection. This may be his wife. That's from Ancestry also. The artist does show up in the newspaper articles and in the census as a occupation for a photographer. Okay, this is either Francis or Harry. But what last name, we don't know. He still doesn't put his initials on. He does on this one. And I know that's a J, but I couldn't read that. Okay, you think I didn't recognize it. And then this is from our family again. That's Alderson. This happens to be George Menzimer, who was the father of George Menzimer, I think in the 1920s or 30s, that was county superintendent of schools from Stockton. And this is the Menzimers from the Stockton Apple River area. That's Edith Durstein. You might recognize the name. I believe she had a general store on Main Street for a long, long time. That's either her or that's either her. Okay. And George would have been a nephew to my great-great-grandfather, Jacob Menzimer. There was 4 Menzimer families that came here, and they each had about 10 kids. Jacob had like 9 girls and 2 boys. George had, similar amount, but they were around Shapsville, Apple River, Stockton. One went up to Fountain, Wisconsin, which is above La Crosse. One family went down to St. Louis, and one family went out to the California. Okay, this is a picture in the Warren Museum. Nora Breed and Vera Breed Elizabeth. There is a Vera Rachel Breed born 1900. It's Leonard's and Elizabeth. This is off the internet. If this is the same Vera, because it's Rebecca, Vera, my mistake. That's Vera and her husband. I didn't write it down. Yeah, Herman Wacker and Vera Rachel Breed. That's their wedding photo. But they probably, this lady is a relative possibly that put it on Ancestry. They've probably never seen this. I don't know. I like this. The hat. She looks happy. She's got a necklace. It's a nice looking picture, detail. It's marked on the back again, but this is from Mrs. A.L. Breed. And I think I looked her up. Alvin. And if that's Mrs. A.L. Breed, that was Virginia Klopp. And the family relations, I don't know the relation to Fred Barthel. He looked like buckwheat to me almost because of but the detail again. And it was in Stockton. You can barely see it. It's Stockton because he did that imprint. Cora Putnam. I tried if you don't know her maiden name, and if you don't know her husband's name, it's hard to find women on Ancestry and Family Search because they're not oriented toward maiden names. They usually associate them with the husband or it's Mrs. So-and-so. You can find them. It's just a little harder, I find, to get information once you find that first tidbit. And if they didn't stay in Warren, you have nowhere to look, or if they don't show up in the paper on an article, where do you look? Dobler, Warren. This is the back of that photo. They were probably stacked together with other photos because some of the neighboring photo has bled into the back of that photo. That's Rachel and Francis. No last name again. I wasn't able to find this Will McMillan yet. And I'll just do a quick review of some of the photographers since we've been through. Apple River had 3 that I was able to find. We've shown Walter Wells. I haven't shown 2 more. Hanover had 2 that's in the paper in this time period, 1870 to 1920, or my rough. If you keep coming forward, then it's more research, which is fine. It's just that you get more names and you've got more little trails to track down. Elizabeth has 3, Franklin Kolb, Charles Leonard, Fred Bonhoff. Stockton has 3. We've seen 2, Hansing and Cowles. Warren has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that might be a turnover, not so much as a lengthy thing as people start, they find out, they either go to another city or find another job. I think George Kessler was a photographer in Stockton. He was a brother-in-law to Henning here in Galena, and Henning's a well-known photographer here. George got a job in Iowa as a mail carrier and also delivering mail with his car to the railroad and stuff. So I think he liked that better because he shows up in the census as a mail carrier. It may have paid more, may have been more consistent. There's one of George Kessler's photos. That's Mr. Tucker. So without a first name, I did try to look a little for that. Here again, you could edit that today and bring out the contrast a little better. Keep the original, but just darken it. This is close to Jo Daviess. It's Lena, and it was in our collection. So I looked them up. Because when you're looking for old cemeteries and relatives around Jo Daviess County, just because that line there says Wisconsin, and there's a cemetery 100 yards away, which is West Ella, that's Apple River Cemetery, one of them. It's in Wisconsin. But when you Google on the internet, it's not going to show it unless you ask for Wisconsin. And there's other ones like that, especially along the state line. White Oak Springs, White Oak Village, Veda Grande, which is a little cemetery with a dozen stones, west of Stockton, right across the state line. Okay, this is from the Warren Museum. So, stemware jewelry and bread plate belonging to Minnie Breed. So that's what they're interested in. What I was interested in is these. Those are daguerreotypes. So I brought one, and it's a highly polished piece of copper with silver on it. It's a piece of copper. This is out of the case and just hold it by the edges. It is rough, but it was covered in a glass because they were very delicate. So they put a glass behind it because if you touch it, you could impact the image. Interesting thing, this is a reverse image. This is the negative. It's the picture, only it's reversed. So there wasn't a negative to this. But these were the first ones, 1839, I think in Europe, 1840s here. And then it's got a case. It's got that copper plate. It's got a piece of glass over it. This little over is a piece of brass that's bent around the edges, crimped to keep it all together. And then they put another little piece of metal around the edge. and it's a mirror image. I think it protects the whole thing together. But I got to go back and look at these without the reflection to see if these are the breeds. And there were Daguerre-type artists here in Galena, and I believe ours are at the Historic Museum, and it's a very famous Alexander Hessler took the first photograph of Abraham Lincoln without a beard. He went to Chicago and was associated with Northwestern University. We were too small, I guess. He was also one of the first to take a picture of the Falls of St. Anthony in Minneapolis. He also has a picture of a person in Galena, a blacksmith with a hammer and an anvil, and there's a little colored African American guy handing him a horseshoe. You could Google that on the internet. So this is E.J. Buss, was a photographer in Apple River. I mean, the interesting thing on Apple River, I've been there recently. There's not a lot there. There was a lot there, as I gather reading the newspapers, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. They were shipping all kinds of stuff every day to Chicago. You know, produce, livestock. It's just interesting, you know, yesterday and today. Hanover, same thing. Savannah Army Depot, it closes. If you go to Savannah today, that's the one that shocked me. Railroad's not there anymore. All the tracks in the town, there's hardly anything left. Stockton's still living, sorry. Still stable and growing. Warren's not too bad, but if you drive around, they have some old houses. They need some work, a little bit more than some of ours, but they have some old houses. Dawson, I wasn't able to find anything up until this point on who he is. We'll find him. The Warren Library has all of the original Warren newspapers in a room, 1857 or 8 up to whenever they stopped publishing it in the 1960s. They have the original copies. Now that has been microfilmed once because we have microfilm of it, but it's just neat being the historical room was digitizing the gazettes because the paper in the 1870s and 80s was crumbling because of how it was manufactured. The early papers, the 1830s, 40s, 50s, were cotton and linen, and it didn't deteriorate like the more modern paper in the 1870s and 80s. Didn't yellow. They did have insect damage, but it's just interesting that they have all the original copies. I said original copies, originals. Bardell was a photographer in Galena, but it's interesting, for a short period of time, he started off in Scales Mound. And we all know how big Scales Mound is. It is. They colorized daguerreotypes. They colorized tintypes. I've got one coming up that's very nice. And they colorized these. I threw that in because if I didn't have enough slides in time, I wanted to have one. My uncle Eldon Glick died about a year ago, and he had a book, and it's this gentleman's photo album. He was in the Civil War in New York, and it's about 30 carte de visites, all in a photo album with the little cartouche or the oval. You can take them out and see on the back. He moved to Lena, and he's buried there. But it's got all of his regiments, major, lieutenant, colonel, surgeon, that's all there. And I looked online, and there's a New York military museum that has some of the photos. I need to get that whole thing back to them on the military, because then if they don't have them all, I may keep him. Or you don't donate it to the Lena Museum, since he's buried there and he has relatives. Okay, not edited, edited. I just threw it in because you can see some more detail if you change it to black and white, increase the contrast. It's an Apple River photographer. That's a tintype. I threw it in because he came from the Red River Colony of the North, and you guys all know that's Winnipeg, Canada today. And if you've heard the Shetland name, they came from the Red River Colony of the North in 1826. And some Monier, other names, there's 30 or 40 of them. Think of Canada, 1820s. I've been to Winnipeg 20 years ago. It's still cold. 1820s. No housing, no food. They came from Switzerland. They went up through Churchill Bay. They were late in the season. There's icebergs. They got to get in rowboats. They go down the lake to get to where they're going. They weren't expecting them. They had to split them up because it's the middle of winter. And then for several years, they have grasshoppers. And the Red River of the North flooded, I think in North Dakota about 15, 20 years ago. That's the same one. They had floods and pestilence. These guys were aware that there were Swiss in St. Louis. So they said, that's it, we're moving. So they go overland down to Minneapolis, which wasn't Minneapolis, it was just a fort. Go down the Mississippi River, Prairie du Chien, Galena, St. Louis. And then when the lead mines open up, 1826, 27, and the Gratians come back up, a lot of those came back up. But his son was a pioneer artist, and this is his book. He didn't live that long, but he drew watercolors through the years, and all the military people would collect these. These are like 4 by 8, 8 by 10. West Point Museum has some. There's some in museums, and if he would have lived longer, but that tintype is in this book. They figure he would have rivaled Catlin, the other Western watercolorist, self-taught, and this gentleman in Stockton. The artist lived in St. Louis, his son. And it's a little side light. That's from Harper's Magazine. Where'd they get the image? It's from a tintype. I wanted, how would a guy engrave that so when you print it that it looks almost like, that's another subject we got to get into. This was just a nice book. It took the guy, Josephy, his son was Peter. Had a boy of 15. They left Switzerland, and they had a pamphlet. Lord Selkirk wanted settlers for the fur trade, so they're telling them how good the land was, how good the climate was. Well, even today, I mean, how many of you want to go? You know, I've been to Saskatchewan. There's a growing season, but it isn't that long. There's towns, but they're pretty far apart. If you want to go anywhere, go to Alberta, because of the mountain ranges, which I didn't know, is the weather there is not like out in the plains, like the Dakotas and Manitoba, where the wind just comes down from the North Pole. Anyway, it's a tintype. If you're cart to visit, if you're out at antique shop and there's a stamp on the back, during the Civil War, as they were collecting money, you know, it's 2 cents, 3 cents, 8 cents. But that would date it if the stamp's still there, unless the stamp's been removed by stamp collectors. Cabinet cards. I didn't bring any because I didn't have any examples. Those are the larger, sort of 5 by 8 almost. And album imprints are, all of these are a thin paper on that cardboard. There's my tintype. That's her. Unknown, but it's colored. What do we think? Look at that. It'd be nice to know more on it, but you got a scarf. I threw in that Ulysses Grant had a brother. He had two brothers working here. This one is buried up at Greenwood Cemetery. It's just down from the Washburn Monument, the big obelisk. Samuel Simpson Grant. That stone has recently been cleaned 5 years ago by Cindy Pebbles, who worked for the city but retired. Is now probably happily fixing up her house, which she has been on the porch and painting it. I think it was more of a disease thing that I'd have to look into it. Tuberculosis was pretty common. I think they called it consumption. But if somebody in the family had it and they're all living in the same house, taking care of people they didn't know, it would be contagious. You know, there'd be other people in the family that would get it. Original photo, edited. It's close. It was an example from a Mr. Nye in Platteville. He was in the Civil War. He was there a long time. That's a daguerreotype. This is from Alfred Mueller's. It's a photo of the originals. I haven't checked to see if the historical room has the originals. Blish was an early carpenter here. Well, like we're talking 1840s, 1850s. Now that you said that, the question I have is this a Hessler? Because it fits the time period. See, in Hessler, once in a while, the photographers would put their name on here. But same thing, if you're ordering stuff, how many do you order with your name? How do you order? You know, if you run out, you got to get one without your name. That's a brother of George Kessler, and threw it in. Barner's a Galena photographer, and it's a copy of a copy. And that's George Kessler, brother-in-law to Henning. And I'm almost positive Henning married his sister. And so if his brother-in-law knows photography and you need a job, and you're probably working when you're younger, you'd learn it. But he didn't stick with it. That's Eric when he was younger. No? So is this on the chair? And they had studio furniture and they had backdrops, drapes, if you didn't want the window or the light. And there's hundreds of these. That antique store I went to Madison a couple of weeks ago, it's up there by Home Depot. So the guy had 3 boxes, mostly around Wisconsin, a few from Northern Illinois, Iowa, and he wanted $3 a piece for them. And we have a whole drawer down in the history room that aren't identified. But on the back, they'll be from like Anna Felt's album, Drenning Sisters family album, and all these names, but they're not in the albums anymore. Where if you had one and sort of associated or seeing where they would connect or how they were related. But as an object for styles and what was going on, they're still useful. Our history museum, I've been down there, but that's like last year. What was I down there for? Don't remember. The only one I think I have of B.P. Skewis, who followed W.C. Wells in Apple River. It's not as clear, but I hadn't edited it. There's nobody holding them kids. Look at these socks. They could be. You got all the parents talking all their tricks that they used to use. Tied the kids to the chair. Well, Olin Mills is the only one I remember when we were young. I do have a baby picture, but that's in an oval. The next one, we're sitting on his little bench with the carpet, 4 years old or something. Okay, Vern Ashmore, Elizabeth, Illinois. I did look up a Vern Ashmore, but again, I've got to find a little more connection. If this is him, he was born 1891, so that looks like a year old or less, I think. He dies 1976 in Hennepin, Minnesota. Ancestry, a lot of people put pictures of their family, but there was none on there. If you do, you can upload them, and people could associate with them, to see if that was the same Vern Ashmore. What's he got him in, a water jug, lemonade jug, a mirror, or, the shield? No names again. It is an Elizabeth picture. And I don't know enough people in Elizabeth, or if somebody had more contacts, or if someone was interested for, it was just time and effort. You might find, you may not. They do look like twins now that we said that. No, they're wearing identical dresses. Did anybody ever know why did they save on clothing? Or if you had a girl born first, why would, because a lot of the boys were in dresses in the, huh? Oh, so the parents again, more of that's what's going on. There's photo artists, not just photographers, so they could take just, and that we could get more detail if I edited it. Don't know who it is. It's probably one of the descendants. I get down there a little, Evergreen Cemetery and Lost Mound Cemetery, and there's a gentleman that I made contact with that has a cemetery on his land that they don't allow anybody on, that I want to get on, that's been there for 140 years. Because he says he has an original cast iron fence around it. But I could get down around there and follow up on some of this. It'd be neat. 52. That's Kolb. That's my last slide. Well, thanks for coming.